The sun beat down on the unforgiving landscape, a relentless hammer against the cracked earth. Dust Creek was less a town and more a testament to human stubbornness. A scattering of weather-beaten shacks and one saloon clinging to existence in the heart of nowhere. Evelyn Reed, her face streaked with a mixture of sweat and grime, held her baby son Thomas closer to her chest. The baby was barely 6 months old, a fragile anchor in a storm of desperation. She had been on the move for weeks, a ghost in her own life, always looking over her shoulder. The man she was running from was not a bandit or a lawman, but something far more insidious, a cruel, possessive figure from her past who believed he owned her and, by extension, her child. His name was Silas, and his memory was a cold knot in her stomach. He was a man of connections, of dark dealings, and he would stop at nothing to reclaim what he considered his. Evelyn's journey had been a series of false starts and dead ends. She had worked odd jobs, traded what little she had for food and shelter, and slept in barns and under the stars. But the baby needed more. He needed stability, a roof that didn't leak, and food that wasn't a gamble. And so she had come to Dust Creek, a place so insignificant it might just offer the anonymity she craved. The main street was a desolate line of structures, a general store, a blacksmith, the saloon. The air hung heavy with the smell of dust, horse manure and stale whiskey. Evelyn felt a familiar wave of panic. This place felt too exposed, too raw. But she had no other choice. Her meager savings were gone, and Thomas's small, hungry cries were a constant, heart-wrenching reminder of her failure to provide. She noticed a man standing by a hitching post outside the general store. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his face was etched with the lines of hard work and solitude. He wore a simple plaid shirt, denim trousers, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his eyes. He wasn't a gunfighter. He was a rancher, a man of the land. His posture was one of quiet strength, not of swagger. Evelyn took a deep breath, her heart pounding. She had to try. She approached him, her voice barely a whisper, the words catching in her throat. "Mister," she said, her voice raspy, I need work. Anything." The man turned his head slowly. His eyes, a startling shade of green, met hers. They held a depth of weariness, but not unkindness. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on the tiny bundle in her arms. "This is a ranching town, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Not much need for a woman and a child. There are a few homesteads on the outskirts, but—" He trailed off, the unspoken hardship of life in this region hanging in the air. Evelyn felt tears prick at her eyes. She had traveled so far, held on to hope for so long, only to be met with the same reality. "Please," she said, the word a desperate plea. "I'm a good worker. I can cook, clean, do anything you need on a ranch." The man's gaze softened slightly. He saw not a swindler, but a woman at the end of her rope, clutching a child she was clearly fighting for. His name was Caleb Sterling, and his ranch was an hour's ride outside of town. It was a lonely life, and the emptiness of his house had become a constant companion since his own mother passed. He considered her request. Hiring a woman with a child was unheard of, a complication he didn't need, but something in her eyes, a mixture of fear and fierce determination, resonated with him. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of a starving wolf protecting its cub. "My ranch is a long way from here," he said, his voice still low, but with a hint of something that wasn't a rejection. "And there's no town nearby, just my house and the hands." "I don't care," Evelyn replied, her desperation overriding her fear. "I just need a place for him." She nodded at the baby, who was now stirring, letting out a soft whimper. Caleb looked at the baby, a tiny, innocent face peeking out from the blanket. It was a face that knew nothing of the harsh world they lived in. An impulse, illogical and powerful, took hold of him. He thought of his own childhood, of the endless work, but also of his mother's warmth. He thought of the empty spaces in his life. "All right," he said finally, "I can use a cook for now. but it's hard work, and the pay is what it is. A wave of relief so profound it felt like a physical force washed over Evelyn. She felt her knees go weak. "Thank you," she whispered, the words choked with emotion. "Thank you so much." Caleb nodded, a stoic gesture. "My name's Caleb Sterling. The ranch is an hour north. I'll get you a wagon." And so, with a promise of work and a ride to a new, uncertain future, Evelyn found a temporary reprieve. But as she watched Caleb walk towards his wagon, a new dread began to form. She had secured a safe haven for her son, but she had not yet faced the biggest challenge of all, the lie. A lie that would bind her to this kind, stoic man in a way she never could have imagined. The lie that the baby was his. She hadn't even uttered it yet, but the words were already forming on her tongue, an unspoken pact with the devil of her desperation. She would have to tell him soon, before he grew to care too much, before the lie became a permanent scar on their lives. But for now, as the sun began to set, she simply held her son tight, a fragile shield against the coming night, and against the truth she was so terrified to reveal. The journey to Caleb Sterling's ranch was a quiet one, save for the rhythmic clatter of the wagon wheels and the soft, cooing sounds of Thomas. Evelyn sat on the wooden seat, clutching her son, her eyes scanning the passing landscape. The world seemed to stretch on forever, a vast expanse of rust-colored earth and scrub brush, with distant mountains looming like silent judges. Caleb drove the wagon with an easy competence, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He didn't ask her name, nor did he pry into her past. The silence was both a comfort and a torment. It allowed her to think, to rehearse the lie she knew she would have to tell. They arrived at the ranch just as the last rays of sunlight faded into a bruised purple twilight. The homestead was a simple, sturdy structure built of timber and stone, surrounded by corrals and a large barn. A few men, Caleb's ranch hands, were finishing their evening chores. They glanced at the wagon, their expressions a mix of curiosity and quiet surprise at the sight of a woman and a baby. Caleb helped her down from the wagon, his touch brief and impersonal. "The bunkhouse is over there," he said, pointing to a smaller building a short distance from the main house. "The cook stays in the main house, but you have a child." He was leaving the choice to her, a small gesture of respect in a world that offered none. But Evelyn knew the ranch hands would be a restless, rowdy bunch, and the bunkhouse was no place for Thomas. "I'll stay in the house if that's all right," she said, her voice firm, "for the boy's sake." Caleb nodded, his green eyes unreadable in the low light. "Follow me." The inside of his house was as Spartan as she expected. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a simple wooden table and chairs stood in the center of the room. A few faded maps and a rifle hung on the walls. It was a man's home, functional and devoid of any soft touches. A small room with a simple bed was offered to her. It was clean and smelled of pine, and for Evelyn it was a palace. After settling in Thomas, she began preparing the evening meal for Caleb and his crew. The kitchen was well stocked, and she worked with a practiced efficiency. As she chopped vegetables and stirred a stew, she felt Caleb's quiet presence in the room. He was sitting at the table, sharpening a knife, his movements precise and deliberate. The silence stretched, filled only by the sounds of her work. She knew this was the moment. The lie, like a venomous snake, was coiled and ready to strike. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Caleb," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He stopped sharpening the knife, his gaze lifting to meet hers. "Yes? The baby. His name is Thomas, and—" She swallowed hard, the words catching in her throat. He's not an orphan." Caleb's expression didn't change, but his grip on the knife tightened. "I didn't think he was." "No, I mean—" She took a deep breath, the lie burning her tongue. "His father. He's a rancher, just like you." This was the part she had to get right. She had to make him believe she was not just a desperate woman with a child, but a woman wronged, a woman who needed a protector. A man like Caleb, who valued honor and family, might be swayed by such a tale. We were together for a while. He promised me things, she continued, a flicker of genuine pain in her voice as she thought of Silas. And then he left. I was alone. I had nowhere to go. Caleb listened, his face a mask of stone. He didn't interrupt, didn't show any sign of judgment or disbelief. She had his full attention. And then she delivered the final blow, the words she had been rehearsing for weeks. "I'd lied about the baby being yours," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of it. "I'm sorry, I needed a way to protect him, to get away." The lie hung in the air between them, a tangible thing. Evelyn waited for the anger, the rejection. She expected him to throw her and Thomas out into the night, to call her a fraud and a liar. But Caleb did none of those things. He simply looked at her, his green eyes searching hers, seeing the fear and the desperation. He saw the truth behind the lie, a mother's fierce need to protect her child. He placed the sharpened knife on the table. "You lied to protect your son," he said, his voice quiet, his tone devoid of accusation. "I understand that, Evelyn." He said her name for the first time, and it sounded alien, yet familiar on his tongue. "I don't know who this other man is, or why you're running," he continued, "but my promise stands. You and the boy have a place here. The truth of his birth doesn't change that." Evelyn stared at him, stunned. He wasn't angry, he wasn't disgusted. He was accepting. Her carefully constructed lie had been torn down, and instead of finding a monster, she had found an unexpected ally, a man who understood the impossible choices a person had to make to survive. "Why?" she whispered, the single word a testament to her disbelief. Caleb gave a small, weary shrug. "This life, it's a lonely one, and a boy needs a father. And you need a safe place to land. It's simple as that." But Evelyn knew it wasn't simple. His promise was a heavy one. It wasn't just about providing a roof and food. It was about becoming a figure in Thomas's life, a stand-in father. She had lied to him, confessed the lie, and yet he was still willing to take on this impossible burden. As she turned back to the stew, a new and different kind of weight settled on her shoulders. The lie was gone, but in its place was the overwhelming reality of his kindness. This wasn't a business arrangement. It was a bond forged in a moment of vulnerability and a selfless act of compassion. She had found a protector, but in doing so, she had created a debt she didn't know how she could ever repay. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her past was a predator, and it was only a matter of time before it found her. The days that followed settled into a quiet, difficult rhythm. Evelyn took on the duties of the ranch cook with a fierce determination. She rose before the sun, preparing coffee and a hearty breakfast of bacon, eggs, and biscuits for Caleb and his hands. The men were gruff but respectful, and they quickly came to appreciate her cooking. For the first time in months, Evelyn was not just surviving. She was working, contributing, and feeling a semblance of normalcy. Thomas, with his bright eyes and soft curls, became the unlikely heart of the homestead. The ranch hands, initially stoic and distant, found themselves captivated by the boy. They would pass him around during meals, their calloused hands surprisingly gentle as they cooed at him, showing him small trinkets they found on the range, a smooth river stone, a bird feather. Thomas, in turn, would gurgle and giggle, his innocent laughter a rare, beautiful sound in the quiet, dusty expanse of the ranch. Caleb, however, kept his distance. He was a man of routines, and the addition of a woman and a child had disrupted his carefully constructed life of solitude. He worked from dawn until dusk, tending to the cattle, mending fences, and riding the perimeter of his land. He was a silent presence in the house, a shadow who moved with purpose. He would come inside for meals, say little, and then return to his tasks. Evelyn understood. Her presence was a complication, a reminder of a world he had long ago chosen to separate himself from. He had made a promise out of a sense of duty, not desire, and she knew she couldn't expect him to be anything more than what he was: a protector, a provider, and a man who was now burdened with the secret of her past. One evening, after the hands had retired to the bunkhouse, Evelyn found Caleb sitting on the porch, his gaze fixed on the endless star-strewn sky. She brought him a cup of coffee, the steam rising in the cool night air. "Thank you," he said, taking the mug. "You don't have to stay out here," she said, her voice soft. "I'm not going to bite." He gave a small, humorless chuckle. "I know that. It's just, I'm not used to it, the noise, the change." Evelyn sat down on the step beside him. "I know I've changed things. I can leave if you want me to. I won't hold you to your promise." Caleb's head snapped around. "Don't you ever say that again," he said, his voice low and firm, a steel edge to it she hadn't heard before. "My word is my bond. I told you I'd take care of you and the boy, and I will. You're safe here, Evelyn." The use of her name again, with such a stark finality, was a powerful affirmation. He wasn't just tolerating her, he was taking on the weight of her burden as his own. "It's just," she began, her own voice wavering. "It's hard to accept such kindness. I haven't had much of it." Caleb turned his gaze back to the sky. "Kindness isn't a debt to be repaid, Evelyn. It's just something you do for someone who needs it." His words struck a chord deep within her. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, they held a quiet power. "I need to know," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "This man, the one you're running from, what's his name?" Evelyn's breath hitched. She had hoped she wouldn't have to say the name out loud. To speak it was to make him real, to summon the darkness she had left behind. "Silas," she said, her voice a tremor. "Silas Sterling." Caleb was silent for a long moment. He put his mug down on the wooden planks of the porch. "Sterling," Evelyn nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He's not a relative, if that's what you're thinking. He took my family's last name. We had a business arrangement. My family was in debt to him. He was a ruthless man. He said he would take me to pay the debt." She didn't mention the rest, the abuse, the possessiveness, the terrible truth of why she ran. But she didn't have to. Caleb's mind was working, putting the pieces together. Silas Sterling. The name rang no bells, but there were many ruthless men in the West. It wasn't uncommon for them to adopt a new name, a new identity to escape their past. The possibility that this Silas Sterling was a man of some means, a man with a reputation, was a new weight on Caleb's shoulders. "He's a dangerous man, then," Caleb stated, his voice flat. "Yes," Evelyn confirmed, her voice barely audible. "He won't stop looking for me. Not until he finds me." Caleb stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, his back to her. He was silent for a long moment, the muscles in his shoulders taut with tension. The weight of her secret was a physical thing, a burden he was now choosing to carry. "Then we make this home a fortress," he said finally, his voice a low, resolute growl. "He won't find you here, Evelyn, not as long as I'm standing." His words were not a promise, but a vow. He was no longer just a kind stranger. He was her protector, a shield between her and the darkness of her past. And in that moment, Evelyn felt a strange mix of terror and relief. She had found a place of refuge, a man of honor, but she also knew that by sharing her secret she had put him in harm's way, and the shadow of Silas Sterling was now a looming threat over not just her, but everyone on the ranch. The weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of life on the Sterling ranch became the only rhythm Evelyn knew. The landscape, once a symbol of her desperate flight, now began to feel like home. She still cooked and cleaned, her hands calloused, but her heart feeling a little less bruised with each passing day. Thomas was growing, his laughter echoing through the small house, a constant melody that filled the silent spaces. Caleb's demeanor, while still stoic and reserved, had softened around the edges. He no longer ate his meals in near silence. He would ask her about her day, about Thomas. his questions simple but genuine. He learned to read the subtle changes in her expressions, the way a small smile would light up her face when Thomas would grasp his finger, or the tired slump of her shoulders after a long day. He also began to learn her tells, the way she would subtly tense when a stranger rode by, or when a distant sound, like a horse's hooves, broke the stillness. Their relationship was an unspoken dance, a fragile tapestry of trust woven with the thread of Caleb's unwavering promise. He was a father figure to Thomas in every way that mattered. He taught the boy to grasp his thumb, to gurgle with a deep, rumbling laugh that made Evelyn's heart ache with a strange mix of joy and sadness. He built a small, sturdy rocking horse for the boy, a labor of love that he worked on late into the nights. One afternoon, Evelyn watched from the porch as Caleb returned from the fields, Thomas balanced on the saddle in front of him. The sight was so natural, so right, that it took her breath away. Caleb dismounted with practiced ease, his arms secure around the boy. He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes as Thomas let out a squeal of delight. When he reached the porch, he handed Thomas to her. The little boy reached for Caleb, his small hand patting his cheek. Caleb's smile faltered for a second, and a strange, haunted look passed through his eyes. He looked at Evelyn, and the unspoken question was there. Was he getting too attached? Was this a mistake? Evelyn, without thinking, reached out and placed her hand on his arm. "He loves you," she said, her voice soft. "He's never known a father's touch, Caleb, and you've given him that." Caleb's gaze dropped to her hand on his arm and then back to her eyes. "He's not mine, Evelyn," he said. The words, a low, painful reminder of the truth. "I know," she replied, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "But you're his." The weight of those words settled between them. It was a truth they both knew, a reality that was a testament to his character and a stark reminder of the lie she had told. Their fragile peace was shattered one crisp autumn afternoon. A rider, a lone figure on a dark horse, appeared on the horizon. Evelyn felt a familiar chill of dread spread through her. Her first instinct was to grab Thomas and run, but she knew there was nowhere to go. She watched as the rider approached, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Caleb was in the corral, mending a fence. He saw the rider too, and his movements stilled. The rider was not a local. He had the look of a man who belonged to the city, his clothes clean, his posture too rigid for a ranch hand. He was dressed in a dark suit, his face a hard, cold mask. He was a man of business, but with the predatory glint of a wolf in his eyes. He dismounted with an unsettling grace and walked towards Caleb. Evelyn watched from the porch, Thomas held tightly against her chest. She couldn't hear their words, but she could see the tension in Caleb's stance, the way his shoulders squared. The man gestured, his movements precise and controlled. He was asking questions, and Caleb was answering, his head shaking slowly. The man's gaze swept over the ranch, and then, inexorably, it landed on the house, on her, on Thomas. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. It was him. It wasn't Silas, but it was one of his men. A man she recognized from the shadows of her past. She had seen him before, a silent, menacing figure in the background of Silas's life. The man said something to Caleb, and then he pointed directly at her. Caleb took a step, a protective gesture, and his hand moved subtly to his side, where his pistol was holstered. Caleb's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, but held an undercurrent of steel. "He was asking for a man named Silas," Caleb told her, his face grim, "asking if I had seen him if he was in the area." Evelyn's legs felt like they would give way. "What did you say?" "I told him I didn't know him," Caleb said, his green eyes fixed on her, "and that no one here was to be bothered. He said he was just looking for a friend. He said he would be back, and then he left." But the man's words were a threat, a clear message. He was not just looking for Silas. He was looking for someone who knew Silas, and now he had seen her. The silence that followed was heavier than any they had known. The sanctuary they had built was now tainted by the shadow of her past. The lie was gone, but the threat was very, very real. Caleb's promise had now moved from a matter of honor to a matter of life and death. The man had a good look at her, and he would report back to Silas. It was only a matter of time before they came back, and this time they wouldn't just be asking questions. They would be coming for her and for the boy, and Caleb, by his own choosing, would be standing in their way. The brief, chilling visit from Silas's man was a turning point. The ranch, once a haven of quiet solitude, now felt like a target. The atmosphere, once relaxed, became charged with a new, ever-present tension. Caleb's quiet vigilance transformed into a relentless guard. He rode the perimeters of the ranch with a newfound intensity, his gaze constantly sweeping the horizon. His hands, too, seemed to sense the shift. They moved with a quiet purpose, checking their weapons, speaking in hushed tones about the stranger. Evelyn, consumed by a familiar terror, felt the walls of her fragile peace crumbling. The past was no longer a distant memory. It was a looming threat, its cold breath on her neck. She found herself watching the road from the kitchen window, her heart jumping at every distant sound. One evening, after Thomas had been put to sleep, Caleb sat at the kitchen table, meticulously cleaning his rifle. The sight of the weapon, a symbol of their new reality, sent a tremor through her. "We need to be prepared," he said, his voice low. "He knows you're here, Evelyn. He'll be back, and he won't be alone." "What do we do?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. Caleb looked at her, his expression a mix of grim determination and a strange newfound protectiveness. "We fight. This is my land. He won't take you or the boy from me." The word "me" hung in the air, heavy with meaning. He was no longer just an apathetic protector. He was a man who had taken ownership of a promise. He had claimed them, in a way, as his own. "He's a powerful man, Caleb," she warned, her voice trembling. "He has men in his pocket. He's not a rancher. He's a snake in the grass." "I don't care if he's the devil himself," Caleb replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "He's not taking what's mine, not without a fight." His words, while terrifying, were also a powerful balm to her soul. She had never known such unyielding protection. All her life she had been a pawn, a possession. Now she was under the fierce, unwavering guard of a man who was willing to risk everything for her and her son. The ranch hands, sensing the seriousness of the situation, rallied behind Caleb. They were men of the West, used to hardship and conflict. They saw the purity of Caleb's actions and the innocence of the child, and they understood the unspoken code of the land. A man protects his own. Days turned into a grueling period of preparation. They reinforced the doors and windows of the main house. They dug defensive positions near the corrals. Caleb taught Evelyn how to use a shotgun, his hands guiding hers over the cold steel. Evelyn was a quick study, her fear transforming into a fierce resolve. She would not be helpless again. She would fight for her son, for her life, and for the man who had given her a chance at a new beginning. The physical preparation, however, was just a small part of the battle. The mental toll was immense. Evelyn found herself having nightmares, haunted by the spectre of Silas. His face, his voice, his cruel laugh, they were all a constant presence in her mind. One night she woke up screaming, her body slick with sweat. Caleb was there in an instant, a lantern in his hand, his eyes filled with concern. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply sat on the edge of her bed, a silent, comforting presence. "It's all right," he said, his voice soft. "It was just a dream. He's not here." She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and for the first time she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her fear. "He will be, Caleb. He will be." Caleb's arm came around her, a gentle but firm hold. "Then we'll be ready for him. We'll face him together." In that moment, she realized that their relationship had shifted again. It was no longer about a promise or about a shared burden. It was about something deeper, something that had been forged in the fire of their shared fear and their quiet moments of understanding. She had found not just a protector, but a partner, A man who, despite her lies and her past, had chosen to stand with her against the darkness. As the days passed, the threat from Silas's man seemed to recede, but they knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The ranch was now an armed camp, a bastion of defiance in a world of lawlessness. The ranch hands were fiercely loyal, their respect for Caleb and his quiet courage immeasurable. They had seen his transformation from a solitary rancher into a man willing to lay down his life for a woman and a child who were not his own, and they stood with him. The calm before the storm was a heavy, suffocating thing. Every day was a question of when, not if. Evelyn knew that the moment Silas's men returned, their lives would be changed forever. But she no longer felt the despair of a woman on the run. She felt the fierce resolve of a woman who had found a home, a purpose, and a man who had given her the strength to fight for it all. The lie had been a desperate act of survival, but the bond that had formed in its wake was a truth far more profound and powerful than she could have ever imagined. The tension on the ranch was a living thing, a coiled snake in the grass. The days were long, filled with a silent, watchful waiting. Caleb worked with his hands, his movements now carrying a new sense of urgency. He was fortifying his home, not just with wood and stone, but with a fierce, possessive resolve. Evelyn, too, was changed. The fearful, timid woman who had arrived at his doorstep was gone. In her place was a woman of steel, her hands no longer just a cook's, but a fighter's. She would spend her afternoons practicing with the shotgun, the recoil bruising her shoulder, but the sound of the blast giving her a strange sense of empowerment. She was no longer a victim, she was a combatant. The most profound change, however, was in the relationship between Caleb and Evelyn. The unspoken words between them were a new language, a silent, intimate conversation of glances and shared moments. There was a quiet understanding in the way he would hand her a cup of coffee in the morning, or the way she would watch him ride out for the day, a silent prayer on her lips. Their conversations, once filled with the practicalities of ranch life, now had a new depth. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, they sat on the porch, a quiet space between them. Thomas was asleep inside, his soft breathing a constant, gentle rhythm. "You know," Evelyn began, her voice low, "when I first saw you, I thought you were just a rancher, a man of the land. I never would have thought that you'd be a man who'd risk everything for a stranger." Caleb's gaze was fixed on the horizon. "I'm just a man who keeps his word, Evelyn. That's all." "No," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "It's more than that. You've given me and Thomas a chance, a home, a family." He turned to her then, his green eyes dark in the twilight. "You've given me a chance too," he said, the words a raw confession. "I've been alone for a long time. This is a kind of life I didn't know I was missing." His words hung in the air, a profound admission of a loneliness he had never spoken of. The space between them, once a chasm, now felt charged with a quiet, powerful energy. Evelyn reached out and placed her hand over his. His hand, calloused and strong, was still for a moment, and then his fingers curled around hers, a gentle, possessive hold. "I lied about the baby being yours," she whispered, a ghost of the past. A confession she had already made, but one she felt compelled to repeat, to lay bare the truth of the lie, to ensure he knew what he was getting into. Caleb's grip tightened. "I know," he said, his voice a low rumble, "and it doesn't matter. Not to me." "It should," she said, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I brought this darkness here, to you. I put you and your men in danger." "No," he said, his voice firm. "You brought a child in need of a home, a woman in need of protection. You did what any mother would do." He paused, his gaze fixed on hers, the unspoken words a tangible presence in the quiet night. "And I did what a man should do." He didn't speak the words, "I love you," but they were there in the way he looked at her, in the quiet strength of his grip, in the promise of his gaze. He didn't have to say them. She felt them in every bone of her body. Their fragile peace was shattered 2 days later. The air, already heavy with anticipation, felt like a storm was coming, and it was. A line of riders, a dark procession against the dust, appeared on the horizon. They were not just a few men. There were at least a dozen of them, armed and dangerous, led by a man on a black stallion. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She knew with a dreadful certainty that this was Silas himself. Caleb, who had been on a ridge overlooking the valley, galloped back to the ranch, his face a grim mask. "They're here," he said, his voice calm but filled with an unwavering resolve. "Get the boy. Go to the cellar. Don't come out no matter what you hear." Evelyn nodded, her hands shaking as she grabbed Thomas. She looked at Caleb, and for a moment all the unspoken words, all the fear and the love and the desperation were in her eyes. "Caleb," she began. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his gaze fierce and direct. "I'll be all right, Evelyn. I promised you I'd keep you safe, and I'm a man of my word." He gave her a brief, reassuring squeeze, and then he was gone, a storm of fury and purpose, rallying his men to the defense of their home. Evelyn ran to the cellar, the sound of hoofbeats and distant shouts echoing in the air. She crouched in the dark. Thomas held tight against her chest, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was no longer just a mother on the run. She was a woman in love with a man who was fighting for her, fighting for a family he had chosen to protect. And she could only wait and listen and pray that the man she had lied to, the man who had given her everything, would be able to win this impossible battle. The sounds of the battle reached Evelyn in muffled thuds and shouts, a terrifying symphony of violence from the world above. The cellar, a cold, dark pit of a room, felt both like a prison and a sanctuary. She held Thomas close, his small body a warm, trusting weight in her arms. He thankfully was too young to understand the terror of the moment. He was content, his small fingers wrapped around her own, and she was grateful for his ignorance. Above, the confrontation had begun. The leader of the posse, a man on a magnificent black stallion, dismounted with a calculated grace. He was a tall, lean figure, dressed in dark, expensive clothes that seemed out of place in the dusty landscape. His face was a hard mask, his eyes like chips of ice. This was Silas Sterling, and he had the look of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. He was a force of nature, a predator who moved with a quiet, menacing confidence. Caleb stood in front of his house, his rifle held loosely in his hands, his men fanned out behind him, their faces grim and determined. "Caleb Sterling," Silas said, his voice a low, smooth purr. "I've heard of you. A man of honor, a man who keeps to himself. But it seems you've taken to meddling in other people's affairs." "This is my land," Caleb replied, his voice a low growl. "And I don't take kindly to trespassers. State your business and get off my property." Silas gave a slow, predatory smile. "My business is with a woman. She goes by the name of Evelyn. She took something of mine." Caleb's grip on his rifle tightened. "There's no woman here by that name." Silas chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "Don't lie to me, Sterling. My man saw her. And the child. He saw the way she looked at you. Don't tell me you haven't taken her in. Don't tell me you're not raising my son." The words, "my son," were a blade, cutting through the tense air. Caleb's face remained a mask of stone, but his eyes flashed with a flicker of raw, unrestrained fury. "That boy is not yours," Caleb stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Oh, but he is," Silas said, his smile widening. "The boy's mother, she was mine. A little wildcat who thought she could escape her debt to me, and a man's debt is a man's debt. She and the child belong to me." The blatant disregard for human life, the cold, possessive nature of his words, was a stark contrast to Caleb's quiet, steadfast honor. "She ran from you for a reason," Caleb said, his voice hardening. "She's a free woman, not a possession, and this boy, he's not a payment for your twisted debts." Silas's smile vanished. You're a fool, Sterling. You're standing in the way of something that has nothing to do with you. Let me take the woman and the child, and you can go back to your lonely ranch. No one has to get hurt." "You're not taking anyone," Caleb said, his voice firm and unwavering. "This ranch is their home, and I'm their family." Silas sighed, a sound of weary frustration. "You've made your choice then. Pity. You seem like a reasonable man." He gave a small nod, and his men began to fan out, their rifles raised, their faces as hard and unforgiving as their leaders. "Get down!" "Ubran!" Caleb roared to his men, and the sounds of gunfire erupted, a deafening blast that shattered the quiet of the valley. Evelyn, huddled in the dark, felt a wave of nausea and terror. The battle was real. She had brought this. She had placed the man she was beginning to love and the men who had become her friends in the path of a remorseless killer. The battle was a chaos of gunfire and shouts. Evelyn could hear the distinct sound of Caleb's rifle, a precise, steady rhythm against the cacophony of the other guns. He was a skilled marksman, a testament to his years of solitude and his need for self-reliance. But Silas had more men. The numbers were against them. The sounds of the fight began to recede, a grim sign that Caleb and his men were being pushed back. And then she heard it. A different kind of sound, the splintering of wood, the crash of a door being broken down. Evelyn's heart leaped into her throat. They had gotten into the house. She heard men's voices, rough and triumphant, as they searched the rooms above. She pressed her hand over Thomas's mouth, a silent plea for him to not make a sound. She was a mother, not a soldier, and her only weapon was silence and her fierce, primal love. The cellar door creaked open, a thin sliver of light illuminating the dark. A man's shadow loomed in the doorway. It wasn't Silas. It was one of his men, a burly, brutish figure. The light fell on her face, on the terror in her eyes. The man grinned, a lecherous, triumphant look. "Found you," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sneer. Evelyn clutched Thomas tighter, her mind racing. She had no weapon, no way to fight. She was trapped. But then the man's grin vanished. His eyes widened, and a look of surprise and pain crossed his face. He staggered back, a gasp escaping his lips, and then collapsed to the floor. Silas, his face a grim mask of fury, stood in the doorway. He held a smoking pistol in his hand. "Idiot," he muttered, kicking the fallen man's body. "You don't take a prize with a brute's hands." He looked at Evelyn, his cold, piercing eyes full of a possessive, unsettling light. "Hello, Evelyn," he said, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "Did you think you could escape me? Did you think you could hide from what's mine?" His gaze fell on Thomas, and for the first time, a flicker of something that wasn't coldness, something that looked like a terrifying, twisted form of pride, flashed in his eyes. "And there's my son," he said, stepping into the cellar, the light from the open doorway illuminating his silhouette. He was coming for her and for her child, and Evelyn knew, with a bone-chilling certainty, that she was about to face the true, unvarnished horror of the man she had run from. The low-lit cellar felt like the mouth of a tomb. Evelyn, frozen with a primal terror, stared at Silas. He was not just a threat. He was a living nightmare, a tangible symbol of all the darkness she had tried to outrun. His eyes, devoid of any warmth or humanity, scanned the small room, his gaze resting on her and the boy she held so tightly. "Give me the child, Evelyn," he said, his voice a calm, chilling command. "We'll go back. We can forget all this. You can be my wife, and he'll be my heir." The words were a grotesque mockery of a promise, a twisted vision of a life she would rather die than live. "He's not your son," she whispered, her voice a fierce, defiant rasp. "He's a good man's son, a man who fought for him." Silas chuckled, a cold, empty sound. "That rancher? He's a fool. He stood in the way of a powerful man for a woman and a child who aren't even his. He's probably bleeding out on his own porch right now." A wave of fear so profound it was almost physical washed over her. Caleb, was he hurt? Was he dead? The thought was a sharp, unbearable pain in her heart. "You're wrong," she said, her voice shaking with rage and sorrow. "He's more of a man than you'll ever be." Silas took a step closer, his face a mask of cold fury. He was not a man to be reasoned with. He was a man who took what he wanted, and he wanted his property back. "Don't make this difficult, Evelyn," he hissed. "Give me the boy, now." As he moved, a sound from above stopped him cold. The sound of heavy footsteps. One pair. Unmistakable. Caleb. He appeared in the doorway, a weary but unbroken figure. His shirt was torn, a red stain spreading across the shoulder, but he was on his feet, his rifle still in his hands, his eyes blazing with a fierce, unwavering light. Silas's face twisted into a mask of pure shock and disbelief. "You're alive?" he snarled. "I told you," Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "This is my home. You don't come into my home and take what's mine." Silas laughed, a high, manic sound. "Your home? Your woman? Your son? It's all a lie, Sterling. She told you herself, didn't she? The boy isn't yours. She lied about it. She lied to you." The accusation hung in the air, a final, desperate attempt to sow discord and break Caleb's resolve. Evelyn, her heart in her throat, watched Caleb's face. Would this be the moment? Would the lie, once revealed, finally be the wedge that broke them apart? But Caleb's gaze never left Silas's. He didn't even spare a glance for Evelyn. The lie was old news, a truth they had already faced. "She told me," Caleb said, his voice calm, but with a steel edge that sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine. "And it doesn't matter. The blood in a boy's veins doesn't make him a man's son. The love and protection in a man's heart does, and in that regard, he's more mine than he'll ever be yours." His words were not a negotiation, but a final, defiant statement. He was not just fighting for a woman and a child, he was fighting for a principle, for the very idea of family and love. Silas, his face now a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, raised his pistol. "Then I'll just take what I want," he growled. But he was a second too late. Caleb, with a speed born of years of practiced, deliberate movement, raised his rifle and fired. The sound was a deafening crack in the small, enclosed space. Silas's eyes widened, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, and he crumpled to the floor, his body a lifeless heap. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Evelyn, her legs giving way, sank to the floor, her body trembling with a mixture of terror and overwhelming relief. Caleb stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on the man he had just killed. He then turned his gaze to her, and for the first time she saw the exhaustion, the pain, and the quiet, bone-deep sorrow in his eyes. "Is it over?" she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Caleb simply nodded, a slow, weary movement. "It's over." He walked over to her, his movements stiff and pained. He knelt down, his gaze falling on Thomas. The boy, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded, simply gurgled and reached for Caleb's face. Caleb looked at him, and then back at Evelyn. "He's safe now," he said, his voice a low, broken whisper. "I promised I'd keep you safe, and I'm a man of my word." He collapsed then, his body falling forward, the wound in his shoulder finally taking its toll. Evelyn, her terror momentarily forgotten, rushed to his side, her hands moving to the bloodied wound, her heart a frantic drumbeat of renewed fear. She had found a home, a protector, and a family. But the price of his promise, she now realized, might have been a price too high to pay. The hours that followed were a blur of frantic activity. Evelyn, her hands caked with Caleb's blood, worked with a fierce, desperate focus. She and the ranch hands, who had emerged from their hiding spots after the gunfire ceased, carried Caleb into the house and laid him on his bed. The wound in his shoulder was deep, but thankfully the bullet had passed clean through, avoiding any vital organs. Evelyn, guided by a strength she didn't know she possessed, cleaned the wound with whiskey and boiling water, her hands steady as she stitched the torn flesh. The ranch hands, a silent, watchful presence, helped where they could, fetching water and bandages. They had fought for their home and their boss, and now they were watching a woman, a stranger who was now one of their own, fighting for his life. Caleb, through it all, remained stoic, his face a grim mask of pain, his teeth gritted. He never cried out, never complained. He was a man of the West, used to enduring hardship with a silent resolve. But his silence was a torment to Evelyn, a sign of the pain she had caused him. She had brought this. Her past had brought a bullet to his shoulder, a violent end to his peaceful existence. As she finished the last stitch, she collapsed into a chair, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The storm had passed, but the aftermath was a heavy, emotional weight. The next morning, the world outside was quiet. The bodies of Silas and his men had been dealt with by the ranch hands, a grim but necessary task. The ranch, scarred by the fight, was still standing, a testament to Caleb's courage and the loyalty of his men. Evelyn sat by Caleb's bedside, watching his face. The lines of pain softened in his sleep. Thomas, sensing the change in the atmosphere, was quiet and content, cooing and playing with his small hands. When Caleb finally woke, his eyes fluttered open, his gaze falling on Evelyn. "You're all right," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "I am," she replied, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Because of you." He reached for her hand, his fingers curling around hers. "It was my promise, Evelyn. It was my duty." "It was more than that," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You took a bullet for me, for a child that wasn't yours. You're a hero, Caleb." "No," he said, his voice firm despite his weakness. "I'm just a man who keeps his word." He paused, his gaze filled with a new, quiet intensity. "And I'm a man who loves a woman and her son." The words, so long unspoken, hung in the air. A powerful truth. Evelyn's heart swelled with a feeling she had never known, a feeling of being truly seen, truly loved, not despite her past, but because of the man she had become in the face of it. "And I love you, Caleb," she whispered, her voice a tremor. "And I love you for loving him." He smiled then, a small, weary but genuine smile that reached his eyes. The coming weeks were a period of quiet, painful healing. Caleb slowly recovered, his strength returning with each passing day. The ranch hands, fiercely proud of their boss, worked to restore the homestead, repairing the damage from the gunfight. The ranch, now a site of a bloody battle, was also a place of a new beginning. Evelyn and Caleb's relationship, once a fragile alliance, had been forged in fire. The lie was a distant memory, a tool of survival that had given birth to a profound, unwavering truth. The lie had brought them together, but it was Caleb's honor and Evelyn's courage that had created a real family. One evening, as Caleb was sitting on the porch, a little stronger each day, Thomas in his lap, Evelyn came out and sat beside him. He looked at her, his face filled with a quiet contentment she had never seen before. "I think we'll be all right, Evelyn," he said, his gaze fixed on the setting sun. "I know," she replied, her heart full. "We'll be more than all right." The sun set, a fiery ball of red and gold, on a scene that was both a testament to the past and a beacon for the future. A rancher, a woman, and a child. A family forged not by blood, but by a lie and a promise that was kept at a terrible price. They had survived the storm, and they were now ready to build a life together, a life that was finally truly their own. The whispers of Silas Sterling's demise spread like wildfire through the sparsely populated territories. The official story, carefully constructed by Caleb and his loyal ranch hands, was that a notorious outlaw had been dealt with. No mention was made of Evelyn or the desperation that had brought her to Dust Creek. The world didn't need to know the messy, human truth of her escape. For Evelyn, this was a blessing in disguise. The constant threat, the icy dread that had been her unwelcome companion, finally began to recede. Caleb, though still recovering, was a different man. The violence he had endured and inflicted had etched new lines of resilience onto his face, but it had also softened him. He spent more time with Thomas, his gruff exterior giving way to a paternal warmth that brought tears to Evelyn's eyes. He taught the boy the names of the constellations, pointing them out on clear, star-dusted nights. He showed him how to skip stones on the creek and how to identify animal tracks. Thomas, in turn, adored him, his laughter a constant, joyous sound that filled the ranch house. Evelyn, no longer solely defined by her fear, found a new purpose. She managed the household with an efficiency born of necessity, but she also began to expand her role. She learned about the cattle, about the cycles of the ranch, and offered Caleb suggestions that, to his surprise, were often astute. Her mind, once consumed by survival, was now free to engage with the world around her, to think about growth and prosperity. The ranch itself began to reflect this shift. Caleb, inspired by Evelyn's insights and his own renewed sense of purpose, invested in better breeding stock. He expanded the corrals and repaired the fences with a meticulousness that spoke of a long-term vision. The ranch was no longer just a place to survive, it was a legacy to build. One crisp autumn afternoon, Evelyn found Caleb sitting on the porch watching Thomas chase a tumbleweed across the yard. A rare, soft smile played on his lips. "He's a strong boy," Caleb said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. "He'll be a good hand on this ranch." Evelyn sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. The intimacy between them had grown, a quiet, unshakable bond forged in shared hardship and mutual respect. "He's got a good father," she murmured. Caleb's arm wrapped around her, his touch a comforting weight. "We're a family, Evelyn. That's what matters." The words, simple and profound, settled into her heart. Family. It was a concept she had once thought lost to her forever. Now it was a vibrant, living reality. She had come to Dust Creek with nothing but a lie and a baby, running from a past that threatened to consume her. She had found not just refuge, but a home, a love, and a future she had never dared to dream of. The ranch hands, too, had settled into a new rhythm. Their respect for Caleb had deepened, and they had come to view Evelyn and Thomas not as outsiders, but as integral parts of the Sterling Ranch. They would share stories with Thomas, teach him small tasks, and their gruff demeanor softened in the presence of the boy and the woman who had brought a new warmth to their isolated lives. As the days grew shorter and the air turned crisp, a sense of quiet anticipation settled over the ranch. It wasn't the dread of impending danger, but the hopeful hum of a new season, of growth and renewal. Evelyn, for the first time in years, felt a profound sense of peace. The scars of her past remained, but they no longer dictated her present. She had faced her demons, and in doing so, she had found a strength she never knew she possessed. She looked at Caleb, at Thomas, and knew that she had not just escaped a nightmare, but had stumbled into a dream, a real, tangible dream that was unfolding before her eyes. One day at a time. The seeds of a new life had been sown in the dust of Dust Creek, and they were beginning to bloom. Dust Creek, a town that had once seemed like the edge of the world, was slowly but surely becoming a more prominent fixture in Evelyn and Caleb's lives. As the Sterling Ranch prospered, so too did their need for supplies and services from the town. Caleb, once content with his isolation, found himself making regular trips to Dust Creek, not just for necessities, but for the subtle exchange of ideas and information that kept a ranch thriving. These trips initially were brief and business-focused. Caleb would load up his wagon with surplus produce or hides, conduct his transactions at the general store, and be back before sundown. But as he became a more familiar face, he began to engage more with the townspeople. He learned about their struggles, their hopes, and the intricate web of relationships that held their small community together. Evelyn, too, found herself drawn into the life of Dust Creek. Her cooking skills were legendary, and she often prepared extra loaves of bread or jars of preserves to trade. She started visiting the general store more frequently, initially to buy fabric or thread, but soon to chat with Martha, the store owner's wife, a woman with a sharp wit and an even sharper eye for gossip. Martha, who had seen Evelyn arrive with nothing but a babe in her arms, now regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and grudging respect. Thomas, now a sturdy toddler, was a town favorite. His infectious laughter and curious nature charmed everyone he met. He would toddle around the general store, his small hands reaching for everything, his eyes wide with wonder. The townspeople, many of them hardened by the unforgiving West, found themselves disarmed by his innocence. However, this growing integration into the town didn't come without its challenges. Dust Creek, like any frontier town, had its undercurrents of suspicion and judgment. Evelyn, the mysterious woman who had arrived with no past, was still a subject of much speculation. Whispers, though less venomous than before, still circulated about her origins and how she had ended up on Caleb Sterling's ranch. One particularly warm afternoon, while Evelyn was at the general store, she overheard a conversation between two men near the saloon. Their voices were low, but her sharp ears caught snippets of what they were saying. "Sterling's doing well for himself. Got himself a woman and a boy out of nowhere. Heard she's got a past. Some say she was running from trouble. Trouble finds its own level, don't it? Wonder if Sterling knows what he's gotten himself into." Evelyn's heart clenched. The old fear, the one she thought she had buried, flickered to life. While Silas was gone, his shadow seemed to linger, manifesting in the distrust of strangers, in the constant scrutiny of those who didn't fit the mold. Caleb, sensing her unease on her return, asked what was wrong. Evelyn hesitated, not wanting to dredge up old fears, but the words had a way of sticking to her. She recounted the conversation, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb listened, his expression unreadable. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dusty main street. Dust Creek is a small town, Evelyn. People talk. They always have, and they always will. But what matters is what we know to be true. He turned back to her, his green eyes meeting hers. Silas is gone. His men are gone. We are safe here, and our truth is on this ranch, with us and with Thomas. That's what they don't understand. That's what they can't take away. He walked over to her and gently took her hands in his. Let them whisper. We have a future to build, and it's a future that starts here, with us. His words were a balm to her soul. He was right. She had faced down a killer, and she had survived. She wouldn't let the whispers of a small town undo the life she had fought so hard to build. The town, however, wasn't just a place for gossip. It was also a place of opportunity. Caleb began to explore expanding his cattle business, and this required more resources and a stronger connection to the outside world. He started talking to the local merchants about establishing regular trade routes, about bringing more goods into Dust Creek, thereby making it a more central hub. Evelyn, in her own way, was also weaving herself into the fabric of the town. She organized a small harvest festival for the children, a simple gathering with games and food. It was a small event, but it was a gesture of community, a way of saying that she was not just a resident, but a participant in the life of Dust Creek. She began to teach Thomas his letters, using the worn-out books she had found in the general store, and the townsfolk would often stop to listen, charmed by the scene. The contrast between the burgeoning prosperity of the Sterling Ranch and the slow, steady growth of Dust Creek was becoming more pronounced. Caleb was a visionary, and Evelyn was his quiet, steadfast partner. Their lives were no longer just about survival. They were about creating something enduring, something that would outlast them, something that would make their corner of the world a little bit better. The town's grasp was tightening, not with malice, but with the simple, inevitable pull of community and shared progress. And Evelyn, for the first time, felt ready to embrace it. Caleb's vision for the Sterling Ranch extended far beyond the immediate needs of his herd. He saw the potential for growth, for expansion, for establishing a name that would resonate beyond the dusty plains of Dust Creek. His ambition, once a quiet undercurrent, began to manifest in tangible ways. He started acquiring more land, purchasing small, struggling homesteads on the outskirts of his territory. He invested in new equipment, and he began hiring more hands, men who shared his work ethic and his dedication to the land. Evelyn, initially surprised by the scale of his plans, quickly embraced them. She saw the spark in his eyes, the same determined fire that had driven her to flee her past. She became his confidant, his sounding board, and often the voice of pragmatic caution. She understood the allure of ambition, but she also remembered the seductive promises that had led her to Silas Sterling, and she cautioned Caleb against overreach. "You're building something incredible, Caleb," she'd say, watching him pore over maps late into the night. "But remember where we came from. Remember the value of steady work, not just grand designs." Caleb, though driven, was not reckless. He listened to Evelyn, his respect for her growing with each passing month. He saw her not just as a partner in life, but as a partner in his ambitions. Her grounded perspective, a necessary balance to his soaring vision. Dust Creek, too, began to feel the ripple effect of Caleb's expanding enterprise. More goods flowed into the town, and the general store, once a modest establishment, began to flourish under Martha's astute management. Other businesses, seeing the potential, started to appear. A small livery stable opened its doors, followed by a modest blacksmith shop that could handle more than just horseshoes. Caleb's success, however, didn't go unnoticed by everyone. There were men in the territory, men with their own ambitions and their own less-than-savory methods, who viewed Caleb's steady rise with a mixture of admiration and envy. One such man was a notorious cattle baron named Jedediah Thorne. Thorne was known for his ruthless business practices, his vast landholdings, and his willingness to use any means necessary to maintain his dominance. Thorne, a man with a reputation as sharp as a branding iron, began to take an interest in Caleb Sterling. He saw the potential of the Sterling Ranch, the prime land that lay adjacent to his own sprawling territories. He also saw Caleb as a rival, a man who was carving out his own empire with an integrity that Thorne found both baffling and infuriating. Thorne's approach was subtle at first. He sent emissaries, men who offered to buy out Caleb, their offers generous but laced with veiled threats. Caleb, however, was not a man to be intimidated. He politely but firmly refused every offer. "My land is not for sale, Thorne," Caleb stated to one of Thorne's men, his voice calm but unwavering. "This is my home, and I built it with my own 2 hands." The rejection only fueled Thorne's ambition and his resentment. He began to exert pressure in other ways. His men would subtly harass Caleb's cattle, driving them towards Thorne's land, creating small, persistent conflicts. They would spread rumors in the surrounding towns, tales of Caleb's supposed arrogance and his unwillingness to cooperate. Evelyn, keenly aware of the shift in the atmosphere, felt a resurgence of her old anxieties. She recognized the patterns of manipulation and intimidation. This was a different kind of threat than Silas, less overtly violent, but perhaps more insidious. It was a war of attrition, a slow, steady erosion of peace. "He's trying to wear you down, Caleb," she told him one evening, as they discussed the latest incident of Thorne's men interfering with their herd. "He wants you to give up, to sell." Caleb, his jaw set, nodded grimly. "He underestimates me, Evelyn. He underestimates what this place means to us. He underestimates us." He looked at her, his green eyes holding a steady resolve. "We've faced worse than Jedediah Thorne. We'll face him too, together." The ambition that had fueled their growth was now being tested by the predatory ambition of another. The Sterling Ranch, once a sanctuary, was now in the crosshairs of a powerful rival. The fight for their future, it seemed, was far from over. The subtle skirmishes orchestrated by Jedediah Thorne escalated. What began as minor harassment of cattle soon turned into more brazen acts. Fences were deliberately cut, allowing Thorne's own cattle to graze on Sterling land, and sometimes to scatter the Sterling herds. Thorne's men, known for their rough-and-tumble ways, started appearing closer to Dust Creek, their presence unsettling the townsfolk and fueling the whispers that had always swirled around Evelyn. Caleb, a man of action, tried to address the issues directly. He rode out to meet with Thorne's foreman, attempting to reason with them, to make them understand the boundaries and the consequences of their actions. But his words fell on deaf ears. Thorne's men were well paid to provoke, and they relished the chaos they created. The economic impact began to be felt. The lost cattle meant lost profits. The constant need to repair fences and round up strayed animals ate into valuable time and resources. Evelyn, who managed the ranch's finances with a keen eye, noticed the strain. The prosperity they had built was being chipped away day by day. "Caleb," she said one evening, her voice laced with worry, "this can't go on. Thorne is not going to stop. He sees us as an obstacle, and he's determined to remove us." Caleb, his face etched with fatigue, ran a hand through his hair. "I know, Evelyn. I've tried reason. I've tried to show him we're not backing down, but he doesn't understand that this is more than just land to us." He looked at her, his gaze filled with a fierce love and a quiet determination. "This is our home, our future, Thomas's future." The ranch hands, loyal to a fault, were growing restless. They were men of the land, accustomed to facing threats head-on, but Thorne's methods were insidious. They were caught in a quiet war, a battle fought with mischief and intimidation rather than open conflict. Dust Creek, too, felt the pressure. Thorne, a man who understood the power of influence, began to court the town's merchants. He offered them lucrative deals, promising to bring more business their way if they sided with him, subtly implying that Sterling's success was a threat to their own established livelihoods. The town, a place that had begun to feel like home, was now divided. Some, like Martha at the general store, remained steadfast in their support of Evelyn and Caleb, recognizing the integrity and hard work that the Sterlings represented. Others, swayed by Thorne's promises of prosperity, began to waver. Evelyn felt the shift acutely. The warmth she had once felt from the townsfolk began to cool in some quarters. The whispers intensified, no longer just about her past, but about Caleb's supposed stubbornness, his refusal to play ball with the dominant forces in the territory. One afternoon, a man named Silas Blackwood, a lawyer from a larger town further east, rode onto the Sterling ranch. He introduced himself as a representative of Jedediah Thorne. Blackwood was smooth and eloquent, his words carefully chosen to convey a sense of inevitability. "Mr. Sterling," Blackwood began, his tone respectful but firm, "Mr. Thorne has made you a generous offer for your land. It is an offer that, frankly, you cannot afford to refuse. Mr. Thorne is a man of considerable influence in this territory. His displeasure can be costly." Caleb listened impassively, his jaw tight. "My land is not for sale, Mr. Blackwood, and my future is not dictated by Mr. Thorne's displeasure." Blackwood's smile was thin, almost imperceptible. "You misunderstand, Mr. Sterling. This is not an offer, it is a statement of intent. Mr. Thorne is not accustomed to being denied. He will have this land. The question is, will you make him pay a high price for it, or will you be wise enough to minimize your losses?" He left Caleb with a chilling ultimatum. The threat was no longer just about cattle and fences. It was about legal maneuvering, about Thorne using his influence to drive Caleb out, to strip him of his property through legal means if he couldn't do it through force. The ambition that had driven Caleb to build his empire was now putting everything he had built at risk. Evelyn felt a cold dread settle in her heart. They had faced down violence, but the slow, calculated machinations of a powerful man like Thorne were a different kind of beast, one that threatened to devour them from the inside out. The legal threats from Jedediah Thorne proved to be more insidious than any physical confrontation. Caleb, despite his resourcefulness and the loyalty of his men, found himself increasingly bogged down in legal wrangling. Thorne's lawyers, with their vast resources, filed injunctions, accused Caleb of cattle rustling, a blatant fabrication, and generally made his life a legal nightmare. The Sterling Ranch, once a place of peace and prosperity, was now embroiled in a constant battle of paperwork and court appearances. Evelyn, ever the pragmatist, saw the danger. "We can't fight him in court, Caleb," she pleaded. "He has more money, more influence than we do. He'll bleed us dry." Caleb, his usual calm demeanor fraying at the edges, paced the floor of his study. "But we can't let him win, Evelyn. We can't let him take everything we've worked for." The pressure began to take its toll. Caleb grew withdrawn, the lines of worry deepening on his face. He spent less time with Thomas, his mind consumed by the legal battles. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching. She had seen this look before, the look of a man consumed by a destructive force, the same look she had seen in Silas Sterling, though Caleb's motivations were noble. Dust Creek was also divided. Thorne had successfully swayed a portion of the townspeople, promising them a share of the prosperity that would come from his expanded operations. The general store, Martha's haven of steadfast loyalty, saw its business dwindle as some customers, swayed by Thorne's promises, took their trade elsewhere. Evelyn felt the sting of this division, the subtle ostracism from those who had once welcomed her. One bleak afternoon, a letter arrived, bearing the official seal of the territorial court. It was a final notice, demanding that Caleb Sterling surrender a significant portion of his land, citing trumped-up violations of territorial law. The letter was a death knell to their hopes of maintaining their ranch as it was. That evening, Evelyn found Caleb sitting on the porch, staring out at the darkening landscape. He looked defeated, the fire in his eyes dimmed. "We might have to sell, Evelyn," he said, his voice a low, broken whisper. He's winning." Evelyn sat beside him, her heart heavy. She reached out and took his hand. "No, Caleb, we're not selling. Not like this." She looked at him, her gaze steady and resolute. "We faced down Silas Sterling. We fought for our lives. We won't let Thorne take our future because of his greed." Caleb looked at her, a flicker of the old fire returning to his eyes. "But how, Evelyn? What can we do?" Evelyn took a deep breath. "We go to the source. We expose Thorne for what he is. We find someone who can fight him on his own terms, but with our integrity." Her idea was audacious, risky, but it was their only hope. She remembered whispers of a lawyer in a larger town, a man known for taking on powerful interests, a man who believed in justice, not just profit. "I'll go," Evelyn said, her voice firm. "I'll go and I'll find him. You stay here with Thomas. Keep the ranch safe." Caleb looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise and a dawning hope. "But it's dangerous. You're still on Thorne's radar." "I know," Evelyn replied, a small, determined smile touching her lips. "But I've faced worse. And this time, I'm not running. I'm fighting." She had come to Dust Creek a fugitive, a woman burdened by a devastating lie. Now she was a partner, a protector, and a warrior, ready to fight for the life she had painstakingly built. The reckoning with Thorne was inevitable, but Evelyn was determined to shape its outcome, not as a victim, but as a force to be reckoned with. Evelyn's journey to the town of Redemption, a bustling hub several days' ride from Dust Creek, was fraught with a quiet tension. She traveled with a small packhorse, her rifle close at hand, her senses on high alert. The knowledge that Thorne's men might still be watching, still looking for any sign of her, was a constant prickling fear. But this time, the fear was tempered by a fierce resolve. She was no longer running from her past. She was confronting it, seeking justice not just for herself, but for Caleb and for Thomas. In redemption, she found Mr. Alistair Finch, the lawyer she had heard whispers about. Finch was a man of sharp intellect and a formidable reputation. He listened patiently as Evelyn, her voice steady and clear, recounted the story of Jedediah Thorne's predatory tactics. She laid out the evidence, cut fences, scattered herds, fabricated legal claims, not as a desperate plea, but as a case built on truth and integrity. Finch, a man who had seen his share of legal maneuvering, was impressed by Evelyn's intelligence and the clear, logical presentation of her plight. "Thorne is a bully, Mrs. Reed," Finch said, his gaze thoughtful. "He uses his wealth and influence to intimidate those who stand in his way. But the law, when properly applied, can be a powerful equalizer." He agreed to take their case, not as a speculative venture, but as a matter of principle. He understood the Sterling Ranch was more than just land. It was a symbol of honest enterprise in a territory often dominated by brute force. Back at the Sterling Ranch, the wait was agonizing. Caleb, with the help of his loyal ranch hands, continued to defend their land, his resolve bolstered by Evelyn's courageous act. They reinforced their defenses, preparing for any further aggression from Thorne's men. Thomas, sensing the heightened tension, stayed close to Caleb, his innocent curiosity a stark contrast to the grim reality surrounding them. Word of Evelyn's actions and Finch's involvement began to spread. Thorne, accustomed to operating with impunity, was blindsided by this unexpected challenge. His attempts to intimidate Evelyn had backfired, galvanizing her and drawing the attention of a legal force that could match his own. The whispers in Dust Creek began to shift, from speculation about Evelyn's past to admiration for her bravery. Martha, in particular, became a staunch advocate, her own business benefiting from the renewed trade as people began to patronize the Sterling-backed enterprises. The legal battle that ensued was fierce. Finch, with Evelyn's testimony and the evidence gathered by Caleb and his men, systematically dismantled Thorne's fabricated claims. He exposed Thorne's methods of intimidation and his attempts to manipulate the townspeople. The tide began to turn. Thorne, facing mounting legal fees and the prospect of public exposure, found himself on the defensive. The climax came not in a courtroom, but on the open range. Thorne, desperate, ordered his men to make a final, aggressive push, attempting to drive the Sterling cattle across a disputed property line. Caleb and his men, armed with Finch's legal assurances and their own unwavering courage, met them head-on. It wasn't a bloody shootout, but a tense standoff, a demonstration of force met by a stronger, more principled stand. The territorial marshals, alerted by Finch and the growing public outcry against Thorne, arrived to de-escalate the situation. The confrontation marked the beginning of Thorne's downfall. His reputation, once a symbol of power, was tarnished. His legal challenges crumbled and his influence began to wane. He was forced to retreat, his ambitions thwarted, his predatory reign in that territory brought to an end. The Sterling Ranch was safe, the land was theirs, their integrity intact. Caleb and Evelyn stood together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and gold. Thomas, now a happy, healthy boy, chased a butterfly across the yard, his laughter echoing in the quiet evening air. "We did it," Evelyn whispered, her voice filled with a profound sense of relief and gratitude. Caleb wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "We did it, Evelyn, together." The lie that had brought Evelyn to Dust Creek had, paradoxically, led her to the truth of her own strength, to the realization of what family truly meant. The Sterling Ranch, once a refuge, had become a symbol of resilience, a testament to the enduring power of courage, love, and a promise kept against all odds. The horizon ahead was bright, filled with the promise of a future they had fought for, a future built on the solid ground of Dust Creek, a future that was truly their own.